The night was dark and quiet, the moon casting a pale glow over the city. The hospital, an old building with weathered walls and creaking floors, stood silently amidst the urban landscape. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves and creating an eerie symphony that echoed in the deserted corridors. Hiroshi Tanaka, a young and diligent nurse, was on his usual night shift. He had grown accustomed to the hospital's atmosphere. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of machines, and the occasional groans of patients. Yet, tonight felt different. There was an unsettling silence that seemed to wrap around the hospital. Like a suffocating blanket, Hiroshi's shift partner, Yuki Nakamura, a compassionate and experienced nurse, was making her rounds in the surgical ward. They had been working together for years, forming a bond over shared night shifts and the countless lives they had cared for. The hospital staff was like a family, each member playing a crucial role in the intricate dance of life and death that unfolded within these walls. The clock struck midnight, and Hiroshi decided to take a break. He walked to the small break room, where the dim light cast long shadows on the walls. The room was empty, save for the faint smell of instant coffee lingering in the air. He poured himself a cup and took a seat, allowing the warmth to spread through his body. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the hospital. As he sipped his coffee, Hiroshi's thoughts drifted to the patients he had seen that night. There was Mrs. Sato, an elderly woman recovering from surgery, her fragile body barely able to move, and Mr. Yamamoto, a middle-aged man battling a severe infection. Each patient had their own story, their own struggles, and Hiroshi felt a deep sense of responsibility towards them. Suddenly, a faint sound caught his attention. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Hiroshi's heart skipped a beat as he strained to listen. The sound seemed to come from the corridor outside the break room. Setting his cup down, he stood up and cautiously opened the door. The corridor was empty, the shadows dancing in the dim light. He took a few steps forward, his senses on high alert. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called out softly, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, only the unsettling silence. He took a deep breath and decided to check on the patients. As he walked down the corridor, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The hospital, usually a place of healing and comfort, felt like a haunted labyrinth tonight. He reached Mrs. Sato's room and gently opened the door. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Satisfied that she was safe, Hiroshi moved on to Mr. Yamamoto's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see the man lying in bed, his eyes closed. As Hiroshi approached, he noticed something strange. Mr. Yamamoto's lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. It was as if he was screaming silently. A chill ran down Hiroshi's spine. He hurried to the bedside and checked the patient's vitals. Everything seemed normal, but the silent scream continued. Hiroshi's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a hallucination? A side effect of the medication? He had never seen anything like this before. Feeling a sense of urgency, Hiroshi decided to find Yuki. He needed to share this strange occurrence with someone he trusted. He left the room and made his way to the surgical ward, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The hospital seemed to grow darker with each step, the shadows closing in around him. When he reached the surgical ward, he found Yuki at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, but her expression quickly turned to concern when she saw the look on his face. "Hiroshi, what's wrong?" she asked, setting the charts aside. "Huh, I saw something strange," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Yamamoto was. He was screaming, but there was no sound. Yuki frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean? Are you sure?" Hiroshi nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes, I'm sure. It was like he was trapped in a nightmare, but he was awake." Yuki stood up and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Let's go check on him together. Maybe we can figure out what's going on. They walked back to Mr. Yamamoto's room, the silence more oppressive than ever. When they entered, they found the patient still lying in bed, his lips moving soundlessly. Yuki approached the bedside and observed him closely. After a few moments, she turned to Hiroshi, her face pale. I've never seen anything like this, she admitted. We need to report this to Dr. Kuroda. Dr. Kuroda, the head physician, was known for his calm demeanor and vast medical knowledge. If anyone could make sense of this situation, it was him. They hurried to his office, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The hospital seemed to be holding its breath, as if it were aware of the strange events unfolding within its walls. Dr. Kuroda listened intently as Hiroshi and Yuki explained what they had seen. He nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious. Let's go see Mr. Yamamoto, he said, standing up and leading the way. When they reached the room, the silent scream had stopped. Mr. Yamamoto lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Kuroda examined him carefully, checking his vitals and observing his condition. After a few minutes, he turned to the nurses, his face grim. I've never encountered anything like this, he admitted. We'll need to run some tests to see if we can find a medical explanation. As the night wore on, the hospital staff worked tirelessly to uncover the cause of Mayor Yamamoto's silent scream. Blood tests, scans, and consultations with specialists yielded no answers. The phenomenon remained a mystery, adding to the growing sense of dread that seemed to permeate the hospital. Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play. He had always been a rational person, relying on science and logic to explain the world around him. But this experience was testing his beliefs. The hospital, once a place of healing, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Yuki, too, was troubled by the events of the night. She confided in Hiroshi during a quiet moment, her voice tinged with fear. Do you think this could be something supernatural? She asked hesitantly. Hiroshi hesitated, not wanting to entertain the thought, but unable to dismiss it entirely. I don't know, Yuki, but whatever it is, we need to find out. As dawn approached, the hospital began to stir with the arrival of the day's shift. The strange events of the night remained a closely guarded secret among the night staff. They knew that speaking of it openly would only cause panic and confusion. Hiroshi and Yuki decided to continue their investigation, determined to uncover the truth behind Mayor Yamamoto's silent scream. They knew that their quest for answers would lead them into uncharted territory, where the boundaries between reality and the unknown blurred. The hospital, with its long history and countless secrets, held many stories within its walls. Some were tales of hope and recovery, while others were shrouded in darkness and fear. As they delved deeper into the mystery, Hiroshi and Yuki would soon discover that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than they had ever imagined. The silent scream was just the beginning, and the horrors that awaited them in the shadows would test their courage and resolve like never before. The dawn broke with a faint glow, casting long shadows across the hospital's sterile corridors. Hiroshi and Yuki, their faces etched with fatigue and worry, gathered in the small break room to discuss their next steps. The previous night's events had left them shaken, but they were determined to uncover the mystery behind Mayor Yamamoto's silent scream. The hospital staff went about their morning routines, oblivious to the strange occurrences of the night before. As Hiroshi sipped his coffee, his mind raced with possibilities. Could there be a logical explanation for what they had witnessed? Or was something more sinister at play? Yuki sat across from him, her eyes dark with sleeplessness but filled with resolve. We need to dig deeper, she said softly, breaking the silence. There must be something in Mr. Yamamoto's history that can explain this. Hiroshi nodded in agreement. We should start with his medical records, he suggested. Maybe there's a clue there that we've missed. Together, they made their way to the records room, a small, dimly lit space filled with shelves of patient files. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and antiseptic. Hiroshi flicked on the light switch, and the fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting a harsh glow over the room. They located Mr. Yamamoto's file and began to pore over the details. He was a man in his mid-40s, admitted to the hospital 2 weeks ago with a severe infection. His medical history was unremarkable, with no previous incidents that could explain his current condition. As they read through the notes, Yuki's brow furrowed. "There's nothing here that stands out," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. Hiroshi sighed, feeling the weight of their task pressing down on him. "Maybe we should talk to his family," he suggested. "They might know something that isn't in the records." Yuki nodded, and they made their way to the visitors' lounge where Mr. Yamamoto's wife, Mrs. Yamamoto, was waiting. She was a petite woman with tired eyes and worry etched into her features. As they approached, she looked up, her expression hopeful yet fearful. "Mrs. Yamamoto," Hiroshi began gently, "we need to ask you a few questions about your husband." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Of course," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Hiroshi and Yuki sat down opposite her, their faces serious. "We've noticed something unusual in Mr. Yamamoto's condition," Yuki explained. "Has he ever experienced anything like this before?" Mrs. Yamamoto shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No, never," she said, her voice breaking. "He's always been healthy, never had any serious illnesses." Hiroshi leaned forward, his tone gentle but insistent. "Has anything unusual happened recently? Anything that might have triggered this?" Mrs. Yamamoto hesitated, her brow furrowing in thought. "There was something," she said slowly. "A few weeks ago, before he got sick, he mentioned having strange dreams. He said they felt very real, like he was living them." Hiroshi and Yuki exchanged a glance. This was the first lead they had. "Did he say what the dreams were about?" Hiroshi asked, his curiosity piqued. Mrs. Yamamoto nodded, her expression troubled. "He said he was in a dark place, like a tunnel. He could hear voices whispering, but he couldn't see anyone. And there was a feeling of being watched, like something was following him." A chill ran down Hiroshi's spine. The description matched the eerie feeling he had experienced in the hospital the previous night. "Thank you, Mrs. Yamamoto," he said, trying to reassure her with a smile. "We'll do everything we can to help your husband." As they left the visitors' lounge, Hiroshi and Yuki felt a renewed sense of purpose. They now had a clue to follow, albeit a mysterious and unsettling one. Back in the hospital, they decided to visit Mr. Yamamoto again, hoping to gather more information. As they approached his room, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corridor lengthened. Hiroshi felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if they were being watched. When they entered the room, Mr. Yamamoto was awake, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at them, his lips trembling as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Yuki gently took his hand, her voice soothing. "Mr. Yamamoto, we're here to help you. Can you tell us about your dreams?" His eyes flickered with recognition, and he nodded slowly. With great effort, he mouthed the words, his expression one of desperation. "Tunnel. Dark. Voices." Hiroshi felt a sense of dread settle over him. The connection between Mr. Yamamoto's dreams and his current condition was becoming more apparent. "Do you remember anything else?" Yuki asked softly. Mr. Yamamoto's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something unseen. He mouthed another word, and this time Hiroshi felt a cold chill. "Hospital." The pieces were starting to come together. It seemed that Mr. Yamamoto's dreams were somehow linked to the hospital itself. As they left his room, Hiroshi and Yuki were both deep in thought. "We need to find out if anyone else has experienced anything similar," Hiroshi said, his mind racing. Yuki nodded in agreement. I'll check with the other nurses, she said. Maybe someone has heard something. As they split up to gather information, Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something truly terrifying. The hospital, with its long history and countless secrets, seemed to be hiding a dark truth. Over the next few days, Hiroshi and Yuki worked tirelessly, speaking with staff and patients, trying to piece together the puzzle. They discovered that Mr. Yamamoto was not the first patient to experience these strange dreams and the subsequent silent scream. There had been other cases scattered over the years, all eerily similar. A pattern began to emerge. All of the patients who had experienced the phenomenon had been admitted to the hospital with infections, just like Mr. Yamamoto. They all reported having vivid, disturbing dreams before their condition worsened, and in each case, the hospital staff had been unable to find a medical explanation. Hiroshi and Yuki presented their findings to Dr. Kuroda, who listened intently, his expression grave. "This is disturbing," he said, after a long silence. "If what you're saying is true, then something very unusual is happening here." Dr. Kuroda decided to bring in an expert in sleep disorders, Dr. Akira Sato, to examine Mr. Yamamoto and the other affected patients. Dr. Sato was a renowned specialist, known for his work in understanding the mysteries of the human mind. When Dr. Sato arrived, he conducted thorough examinations and interviews with the patients. His findings were both intriguing and alarming. There is no medical explanation for what these patients are experiencing, he said. The dreams they describe are consistent with a phenomenon known as sleep paralysis. But the silent scream is something I've never encountered. Hiroshi and Yuki felt a mixture of relief and dread. They were not imagining things, but the lack of a medical explanation left them with more questions than answers. As the investigation continued, Hiroshi began to notice something strange. The more they delved into the mystery, the more the hospital itself seemed to reek. Doors would creak open on their own, lights would flicker, and the air would grow cold in certain parts of the building. It was as if the hospital was alive, aware of their efforts to uncover its secrets. One night, as Hiroshi was making his rounds, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, and he heard a faint whispering sound, just like the one he had heard in the break room. He stopped and turned, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and flickering in the dim light. Hiroshi took a deep breath and continued on, determined to complete his rounds. But the sense of unease stayed with him, growing stronger with each step. When he reached the end of the corridor, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and empty. She wore a hospital gown, and her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Hiroshi froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman stared at him for a moment, then slowly raised her hand and pointed down the corridor. Hiroshi's legs felt like lead as he turned to see what she was pointing at. There, at the far end of the corridor, was Mr. Yamamoto, standing silently with his eyes wide and his mouth open in a silent scream. Hiroshi's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? Or was something truly supernatural at play? He took a step forward, and the figure of the woman vanished, leaving only the lingering sense of dread. Hiroshi ran down the corridor to Mr. Yamamoto, but when he reached him, the patient was gone. The corridor was empty, the shadows once again still. Panting and shaken, Hiroshi made his way back to the nurse's station, where he found Yuki. Her face was pale, and she looked just as shaken as he felt. "Hiroshi," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw her too." They both knew that the hospital was hiding something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. the silent screams, the disturbing dreams, and the eerie presence were all connected. As they stood there, the oppressive silence of the hospital seemed to close in around them, whispering secrets that they were only beginning to understand. The night was far from over, and the horrors that awaited them in the shadows would test their courage and resolve like never before. The hospital, with its long history and countless secrets, held many stories within its walls. Some were tales of hope and recovery, while others were shrouded in darkness and fear. Hiroshi and Yuki were determined to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. As they prepared to face the unknown, they knew that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than they had ever imagined. The silent scream was just the beginning, and the horrors that awaited them in the shadows would test their courage and resolve like never before. The next few days in the hospital were a blur of eerie incidents and mounting tension. Hiroshi and Yuki found themselves caught in a web of inexplicable occurrences, each more unsettling than the last. The hospital, once a place of healing, had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, where fear lurked around every corner. The morning sun cast long, wavering shadows through the hospital's windows, yet the light did little to dispel the creeping dread that had settled over the staff. Patients continued to report disturbing dreams, and more than one had succumbed to the same silent scream that had first afflicted Mayor Yamamoto. Hiroshi's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the escalating situation. The hospital's history was long and storied, filled with tales of triumph and tragedy, but never had it faced anything like this. Determined to uncover the truth, Hiroshi and Yuki decided to delve deeper into the hospital's past. They sought out Mrs. Takahashi, the elderly head of the hospital's archives. With her vast knowledge of the hospital's history, she might hold the key to understanding the events that were unfolding. The archives were located in the basement, a dimly lit maze of narrow corridors and dusty shelves. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and mildew, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they navigated the labyrinthine space. Mrs. Takahashi greeted them with a warm smile, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "How can I help you two today?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. Hiroshi explained their situation, describing the strange occurrences and the silent screams that had plagued the patients. Mrs. Takahashi listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. "You're not the first to experience something like this," she said finally, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "There have been other incidents over the years, though they were few and far between." She led them to a small room at the back of the archives, where a collection of old files and records lay stacked in neat piles. "These are the records of past incidents," she explained. "Some of them date back decades, to when the hospital was first built." Hiroshi and Yuki began to sift through the files, their eyes scanning the yellowed pages for any clues. The records were filled with accounts of strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, sightings of ghostly figures, and whispers in the night. One file, in particular, caught Hiroshi's attention. It detailed the construction of the hospital and mentioned a series of mysterious deaths among the workers. Several men had died under unusual circumstances, and their deaths were never fully explained. "Look at this," Hiroshi said, showing the file to Yuki. "It seems like this place has been haunted from the very beginning." Yuki nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "Maybe there's something buried here, something that was disturbed when the hospital was built." As they continued to search through the records, a pattern began to emerge. The incidents seemed to occur in cycles, each wave of disturbances separated by several years of relative calm. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, awakening periodically to torment its inhabitants. Mrs. Takahashi watched them with a knowing look. "I've always felt that this place held more than just the memories of the living," she said quietly. "There's a darkness here, something that feeds on fear and despair." Hiroshi and Yuki left the archives with a sense of foreboding, their minds filled with more questions than answers. They decided to speak with Dr. Sato again, hoping that his expertise might shed some light on their findings. Dr. Saito listened carefully as they recounted their discoveries. His face grew increasingly serious as they spoke, and he nodded thoughtfully when they finished. "It sounds like you're dealing with something far beyond the realm of normal medical science," he said. "I've heard of places like this, where the very walls seem to hold on to the suffering of those who have passed through." He suggested that they conduct a more thorough investigation of the hospital, focusing on the areas where the disturbances seemed to be most concentrated. Hiroshi and Yuki agreed, though they couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something truly terrifying. That night, as the hospital settled into its usual nocturnal rhythm, Hiroshi and Yuki began their investigation. They started with the basement, where the archives were located. The air was thick with a palpable sense of unease, and their footsteps echoed eerily in the narrow corridors. They checked each room methodically, searching for anything out of the ordinary. In one of the old storage rooms, they found an old journal hidden behind a stack of dusty boxes. The journal belonged to a doctor who had worked at the hospital during its early years. His entries detailed strange occurrences, much like the ones Hiroshi and Yuki had been experiencing. "The dreams, they come every night," one entry read. "Patients scream silently, their eyes filled with terror. I fear this place is cursed." As they read through the journal, a sense of dread settled over them. It was clear that the hospital had been plagued by these disturbances for a long time, and now the cycle had begun again. Their next stop was the surgical ward, where many of the incidents had occurred. The corridors were eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive silence. They checked each room, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. In one of the operating rooms, they found a series of strange symbols etched into the floor. The symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen, and they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "What do you think these are?" Yuki asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hiroshi shook his head, his eyes fixed on the symbols. "I don't know," he replied, "but they don't look like anything good." As they continued their investigation, the sense of unease grew stronger. It was as if the hospital itself was aware of their presence, watching their every move. In the maternity ward, they found more symbols, hidden beneath layers of paint and wallpaper. The ward was eerily silent, the usual sounds of newborns and their mothers, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Yuki felt a chill run down her spine as they moved through the empty rooms. It was clear that the disturbances were not confined to a single area of the hospital. They were everywhere. Their final stop was the old wing of the hospital, a section that had been closed off for years. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper. As they explored the old wing, they found more evidence of the hospital's dark past. There were rooms filled with old medical equipment, long abandoned and forgotten. In one of the rooms, they found a series of old photographs, yellowed with age. The photographs showed patients and staff, their faces blurred and indistinct. But in each photo, there was a shadowy figure in the background, its features hidden in darkness. Hiroshi and Yuki felt a sense of growing dread. As they looked at the photographs, it was clear that whatever was haunting the hospital had been there for a long time, lurking in the shadows. As they made their way back to the main part of the hospital, Hiroshi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He turned to Yuki, his voice tense. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Yuki nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes," she replied. "It's like something is watching us." They hurried back to the nurses' station, their hearts pounding in their chests. The hospital seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Hiroshi knew that they had to act quickly. They needed to find a way to break the cycle and put an end to the disturbances once and for all. But as they stood in the dim light of the nurses' station, they realized that they were dealing with something far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The hospital, with its long history and countless secrets, held a darkness that seemed to feed on their fear. And as the night wore on, Hiroshi and Yuki knew that they were in for the fight of their lives. The silent screams, the disturbing dreams, and the ghostly figures were all part of a larger pattern, one that had been repeating itself for decades. And now, it was up to them to uncover the truth and put an end to the hospital's dark legacy. As the clock struck midnight, the hospital seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. The air grew colder and the shadows deepened, as if the very walls were closing in around them. Hiroshi and Yuki braced themselves for the horrors that awaited them, knowing that the night was far from over. The hospital, with its countless secrets and hidden terrors, was a place where the line between the living and the dead was thinner than ever. And as they prepared to face the unknown, they knew that their courage and resolve would be tested like never before. The hospital's oppressive atmosphere deepened as the night wore on. Hiroshi and Yuki gathered their resolve, knowing that they had to confront the darkness that had plagued the hospital for decades. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, whispering secrets and spreading fear. They began their final investigation in the oldest part of the hospital, the wing that had been closed off for years. As they stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the air grew colder and a sense of foreboding settled over them. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. Each step echoed ominously, as if the hospital itself was watching. Hiroshi held a flashlight in one hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. Yuki walked beside him, her face set with determination. They knew that whatever they were about to face, they had to do it together. The first room they entered was an old storage room, filled with dusty medical equipment and forgotten files. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around them. They searched the room methodically, looking for any clues that might explain the strange occurrences. In a corner, they found a stack of old journals, their pages yellowed with age. Hiroshi picked up one of the journals and began to read. The entries detailed the experiences of a doctor who had worked at the hospital during its early years. His writings were filled with accounts of strange occurrences and unexplainable events. The shadows, they whisper at night, one entry read. The patients are terrified, and I fear the darkness is spreading. Yuki felt a chill run down her spine as she read over Hiroshi's shoulder. It was clear that the hospital had been haunted by these disturbances for a long time. They left the storage room and continued down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The next room they entered was a small office, filled with old furniture and dusty files. On the desk, they found a photograph of the hospital staff, taken many years ago. In the background, a shadowy figure loomed, its features hidden in darkness. Hiroshi and Yuki exchanged a glance, their expressions grim. It was becoming increasingly clear that the hospital's dark history was connected to the present disturbances. As they moved deeper into the old wing, the air grew colder and the shadows lengthened. They entered a large, dimly lit room that had once been an operating theater. The room was filled with old surgical equipment, long abandoned and covered in dust. On the floor, they found more of the strange symbols they had seen earlier. The symbols seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and Hiroshi felt a sense of dread settle over him. Yuki knelt beside the symbols, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What do you think these mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hiroshi shook his head, his eyes fixed on the symbols. "I'm not sure," he replied, "but they don't look like anything good." As they stood in the operating theater, the air seemed to grow thicker, and a faint whispering sound filled the room. Hiroshi and Yuki turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The figure was tall and gaunt, its features hidden in darkness. It stared at them with empty eyes, and Hiroshi felt a wave of fear wash over him. "Who are you?" Yuki demanded, her voice trembling. The figure remained silent, its gaze fixed on them. Hiroshi took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice shaking. The figure slowly raised a hand and pointed to the symbols on the floor. Hiroshi and Yuki exchanged a glance, their minds racing. It was clear that the symbols were connected to the disturbances, but they didn't know how. The figure began to move towards them, its footsteps echoing in the silent room. Hiroshi and Yuki backed away, their fear growing with each step. Just as the figure reached them, it vanished, leaving only the lingering sense of dread. They stood in silence for a moment, their minds reeling from the encounter. "We need to find out what those symbols mean," Yuki said finally, her voice trembling. Hiroshi nodded, his mind racing. They left the operating theater and made their way back to the main part of the hospital. As they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hospital seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy, the shadows whispering and shifting around them. Back at the nurses' station, they found Dr. Saito waiting for them. His face was pale, and his expression was one of concern. "I've been looking into the symbols you found," he said, his voice serious. "They appear to be part of an old ritual, one designed to trap and contain spirits." Hiroshi and Yuki felt a chill run down their spines. It was clear that the hospital's dark history was more sinister than they had imagined. "The ritual was never completed," Dr. Saito continued, "and it seems that the spirits have been growing stronger over the years." Hiroshi felt a sense of urgency settle over him. "We need to find a way to complete the ritual," he said, his voice firm. Dr. Saito nodded in agreement. "I've been researching old texts and records," he said. "There may be a way to finish the ritual and put an end to the disturbances." As they worked together, Hiroshi, Yuki, and Dr. Saito felt a growing sense of determination. They knew that they had to act quickly before the darkness spread any further. The next night, they gathered the materials they needed for the ritual. The hospital was eerily silent, the air thick with anticipation. They made their way to the old wing, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. In the operating theater, they carefully arranged the materials. Following the instructions they had found in the old texts, the symbols on the floor seemed to pulse with energy, and Hiroshi felt a sense of unease settle over him. As they began the ritual, a cold wind swept through the room, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. Hiroshi's hands trembled as he recited the ancient words, his voice barely above a whisper. Yuki and Dr. Saito stood beside him, their faces set with determination. The air grew colder, and the whispering voices grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. Hiroshi felt a wave of fear wash over him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. As they completed the ritual, a blinding light filled the room, and the shadows seemed to scream in agony. Hiroshi felt a powerful force wash over him, and he collapsed to the floor, his mind reeling. When he opened his eyes, the room was silent, the air thick with an eerie calm. The symbols on the floor had vanished, and the oppressive darkness had lifted. Hiroshi looked at Yuki and Dr. Saito, their faces pale but relieved. "It worked," Dr. Saito said, his voice filled with awe. "We did it." As they left the old wing, Hiroshi felt a sense of peace settle over him. The hospital, once a place of fear and darkness, had been cleansed. The silent screams and disturbing dreams were no more, and the shadows had retreated. Hiroshi and Yuki knew that their lives would never be the same. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, their bond stronger than ever. The hospital, with its long history and countless secrets, had been given a new lease on life, and as they walked through the now peaceful corridors, they knew that they had put an end to the hospital's dark legacy. The line between the living and the dead had been restored, and the spirits that had once haunted the hospital had finally found peace. Hiroshi and Yuki felt a sense of satisfaction as they returned to their duties, knowing that they had made a difference. The hospital, once a place of fear and despair, was now a place of healing and hope, and as they looked out over the city, bathed in the light of the rising sun, they knew that they had faced the darkness and won.